This webinar will begin live May 19th, 2022, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, and 11 a.m. Pacific. If you have any questions, please contact us at nlcinfo@simtribe.com or directly by our phone number at 954-985-2315. Next slide, please. I'm your webinar facilitator. My name is Louis Porter Jr. I am the marketing coordinator for the NLC. And once again, thank you for coming out for this webinar. Next slide, please. Today's topic, understanding credit, the next level. Next slide, please. Disclaimer, this webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. Next slide, please. Next slide, because we're not going to be we're using Zoom today. Next slide, please. It is my pleasure to introduce Linnell Smith and Stephanie Cote from OISA Corporation, who will be instructing this lovely webinar. Let me hand it over to them. Thank you so much for all your help.
Awesome. Thank you. Oops, just noticed my mic is tipped over. Thank you so much for the introduction. I do have to preface that Linnell will be joining us a little bit later. It's my pleasure to kick us off. My name is Stephanie Cote. Stephanie Cote, Indigenous Cost Grand Traverse Bando Dawa Minwa Chippewa and Ndimedagos. So my name is Stephanie Cote. I'm a senior program officer here at OISA Corporation and with a financial education and asset building department. And when Linnell joins, I'll have her introduce herself as well. But she is also a senior program officer here at OISA Corporation with the capacity building department. So today we're going to be talking a little bit more about credit. Oops. And I just wanted to highlight that the content here is brought to you by Credit Builders Alliance. So if you've taken credit as an asset, we've adapted today's webinar to be just a portion of that next level talking about credit. And it's just a part of the larger credit as an asset training. And if you joined us Tuesday, or if you've watched the webinar, Credit Building 101, that's also content from Credit Builders Alliance, and you'll see a lot of similar slides. Today, we just wanted to build on Credit Building 101, so taking that credit to the next level. So let's dive into how does credit building work. So if you joined us on Tuesday, or if you rewatched that Credit Building 101, the key to credit building is, and we'll reiterate this a few times, maintaining active on-time trade lines. So paying your bills on time that are reported to the 3 major credit bureaus. So unfortunately, in most cases, our cell phone and cable bills and utilities, insurance payments are not reported to the bureaus. For many low to moderate income individuals and families, rent typically is the largest monthly expense and is not reported to the credit bureaus. But I just want to highlight that Credit Builders Alliance does have a rent reporting platform that they've launched. And so if you are with a tribal housing authority or an agency that does rent units, I would reach out to Credit Builders Alliance. I'll drop the information in the chat around rent reporting because it can be a credit building tool for your tenants. And then lastly, so credit building, talking about the key to credit building, having positive trade lines on your credit report is the only way with someone with no or thin credit history can establish or reestablish a credit score. So in many cases, adding an active trade line is also an effective and faster first step than dealing only with debt with poor credit profiles. Okay. And then I'll pull up. Oh, thank you so much for, if you want to type in a welcome and where you're joining us from, that would be great to see where everyone's joining from. And if I'm speed talking, I apologize. There's a lot of content to cover. So in talking about trade lines, we talked about this in Credit Building 101, but we will be using the term active quite a bit. So we want to make sure that we know what active means. So this concept is foundational to credit building, and you'll want to make sure that you understand it. The definition varies slightly if we're talking about installment versus revolving trade lines. Looking at installment credit first, lenders report both installment loans, such as car loans, student loans, and mortgages, and revolving loans. For an example of an installment loan, for this to be active, it must carry a balance and have a monthly payment, and it cannot be closed. While paying off debt is a good thing, once an installment loan is paid in full, a loan is no longer active and will not continue to build credit. You and your participants may have noticed that your credit score drops after you pay off a car loan or a similar item. This is because it's no longer active on your credit report. You'll still retain positive payment history of your payments and the paid off account, but it's no longer an active account once it's paid. So it won't be building credit. Eventually, an established credit score will disappear if the consumer no longer has other active trade lines. On the other side, looking at revolving accounts, these are credit cards, charge accounts, or lines of credit, which are reported to the credit bureaus. So revolving credit offers an infinite credit building solution as long as it's actively used. In the case of revolving trade lines, active does not mean carrying a monthly balance, but rather to make at least one payment every 6 months. An outstanding balance on a credit card is not required to build credit. Incurring even one small charge each month, paying it in full at each billing cycle will build credit. Many credit building practitioners recommend that their participants use a card once a month for a small essential purpose like streaming service, gas, groceries, and pay off the balance in full by the end of the month. Essentially, you see most of the benefit for credit building purposes. Monthly use as we detailed above. So let's dive deeper into understanding account statuses. So we're talking about active and closed. So there are different pieces of information that can appear on a consumer credit report. The account status is crucial in how different types of accounts can impact the credit score. So we're going to talk about this chart and see down the center, we can see the impact of different account statuses have on our credit report. So here in the upper right quadrant, we've got green, and this is an open credit account with a positive payment status. So it means you're paying those monthly payments on time, and it's an open active account. So let's say you've got an installment, you have a car payment, and you're paying it every month on time. So down in the bottom right, this one's orange. We have an open credit account with some negative information. So in this section, you might have a credit card that's currently 30 days past due. While it's not negative activity, it could bring your score down. And accounts in this category are still open to new activity. And a consumer could resolve the delinquency and bring it back to that positive status. So you can continue to use this account while it's in this category. In the bottom left quadrant, we see that these are accounts that are closed and with derogatory statuses. So this is like a charge-off card. We also see that this is where collections accounts and public records, such as bankruptcies, that are derogatory accounts by definition. While consumers may still be paying off these debts, they're closed to new activity. Therefore, they are no longer avenues for access to credit and can no longer be used for new purchases. So accounts in this category will only negatively impact your credit score. And finally, in the upper left, that blue square reflects the accounts that are closed to new activity, but have been paid as agreed. For example, it might be an auto loan that's paid in full, but closed and no history of missed or late payments. While these accounts ultimately have positive impact on the credit score, there's a diminishing return as the accounts age. So going back to that green, this is where the credit building really happens. Accounts that are open, current, and have recent activity that are considered active, they have the most potential for positively impacting your credit score. It is worth mentioning that accounts in the bottom right do have the potential to become active participants in that credit building. If they're able to resume those regular on-time payments. Negative history and its impact on the credit score does diminish over time. So if you happen to have something in that bottom right corner, maybe you're past due 30 days, just know that time heals all when it comes to credit. Often coaches emphasize that the left side of the chart, the closed accounts, and the accounts in collections. So in this case, these accounts have minimal impact on your credit score and have no potential to become active. So the right side is where the credit building really happens. And hopefully this chart clarifies on how to positively impact your credit score. Okay, let's do a little bit of a knowledge check. We're gonna utilize the chat. Oh, and we have a question in here. Is there a certain amount of time? So once an account is closed, and I think we have some slides that cover this in detail, but I'll just answer the questions as they come up. So as we're looking at the, oh, thank you. So an open credit card is on your account as long as it stays open. So it could be like 50 years. If it's open and active, it can stay all of those, even if you have a past due account, if it hasn't slipped into the red quadrant, so it means it hasn't gone into collections, and it's not a closed account, the orange or that right side of the column will be on your account indefinitely, for as long as it's open. Closed to new activity, if it's collections, anything in the red, those negative will stay on your account for 7 years. And we'll get into, there was a question, yeah, so once it's closed, 7 years, unless it is in good standing, so that blue quadrant, that'll be on your credit report for 10 years. because it's positively impacting your credit. So if you have something that's negative, and we'll talk about this a little later about dates of first delinquency, you really want to get those off your credit report to boost your credit score. But we talk about that a little further down the line. So yes, open accounts indefinite as long as until they're closed. And then once they become closed, 7 years if there's derogatory information on it, or 10 years if it stayed in that green until it was closed. And the slides will be available, I believe, through Native Learning Center. So that's the handout. So let's check. Is it active or is it not? So in the chat, we'll go with that first one, an open credit card that's unused in 1 year. Is it active? Yes or no? So we have a mix. And as I had mentioned before, it has to have been used within 6 months. So the answer is no. Even if it's open, in order for it to be an active trade line, a credit card has to be, and I'll ask my co-host if you could please bump anyone out of the room. Okay. That will be utilizing the chat in a derogatory way. Apologies to anyone that has seen that. So a car loan in good standing with a $2,000 balance. Yes or no? Is it active or is it not? And the majority is correct. So this is active because it's current. It's in good standing and it has a $2,000 balance. So next, a car loan paid off last month. Is this active? Remember, is it in that right-hand column of those quadrants? And again, the majority is correct. No. So once those installment loans are paid off, they're no longer active. They can still positively influence your credit score, but it's no longer opened to new credit. And last, a collection account with a payment schedule. Is it active? So if we remember back to that quadrant, those 4. So even though it does have a payment schedule, all collections are going to be inactive. So they can, collection accounts will only have negative impact on that credit report. It does not mean they should be ignored, but they aren't open to, they cannot be active because they're closed accounts. Okay, great job. Thanks for participating. So just to remember, those credit building practices have at least 3 active trade lines open and pay them on time, but you only need 1 to build credit. So something to remember. Remember to have a mix of installment and revolving. We'll talk a little bit more about how the FICO score is broken down and how having a mix can positively benefit your credit score. 6 months of history. So if you have that revolving credit, just know that you should be making those, having at least 1 payment every 6 months. And remember to pair credit education with support. If you're struggling through your credit journey, definitely reach out and get more education on the process, and look for a credit coach to help you on your journey. So something to note is that just within 6 to 12 months, someone who is credit invisible, who's had no score, if they add an installment loan of $100 and pay it on time, they can become near prime or prime range of credit scores. A consumer with a low score may see an increase of 35 points. So credit building does take time, but for those that are new to credit, it might take a little less time to get those high score ranges. I just want to highlight the difference between credit building and credit repair. So credit repair is a term frequently used by coaches and participants alike, and often used interchangeably with credit building or credit remediation. For an example, you might hear someone say, I need to repair my credit. But credit repair is actually a very specific tactic that involves charging a fee and disputing every negative trade line on an individual's credit report, regardless of whether a customer recognizes it or recognizes the debt as their own. So credit repair is considered a red flag to the credit bureaus. Here we encourage practitioners who are working with to help individuals resolve legitimate errors, manage debt, and deal with collections to avoid the term credit repair. Debt management or credit remediation are the more appropriate terms. And here's just a list of resources. I can drop those in the chat real quick. So some more resources. These will also be in the handouts. So you'll have a PDF of the slides. And there we go. There are some, there are the resources dropped in the chat. So if you want to learn more, feel free to dive into those hyperlinks. Okay, so let's take a step back and look at all the players of credit history. At the center of everything, we're going to have the consumer. Consumer actions influence what goes into the credit report, and this is where credit building can help empower consumers to take control and manage their files. While consumers do have a choice to participate in the financial mainstream by accessing financial products and services, they do not ultimately have control of whether or not the data is shared with the consumer reporting agencies. But ultimately, thanks to important consumer protection laws, consumers can and should take responsibility for monitoring the accuracy of their own credit reports. Lenders and businesses play a key role in the credit ecosystem. Lenders and many other types of businesses feed information about consumers into the credit system and retrieve information out of the system in the form of credit reports and scores. So it's the lender's choice to use credit reports and report borrower information. But it's important to note it's not required to do so. However, once a lender does choose to participate in the system, they must comply with the regulations from the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Then moving right along, we have the lenders and businesses that use report and credit information. We have those credit reporting agencies, or CRAs. And the three national credit reporting agencies are Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. There are many other specialty CRAs that collect data for different purposes, such as housing, employment, insurance, and utilities. Next, we have the companies that create the credit scoring models. The most well-known is that Fair Isaac Corporation, or most commonly known as FICO. We'll talk about the two dominant credit score developers, FICO and VantageScore, in the next few slides. In addition to these independent companies that create the credit score models, the CRAs themselves also create their own scores, as do many large banks and lenders. And then finally, we have the regulators responsible for making sure that all of these key players are abiding to the relevant laws that govern credit reporting. Much of the enforcement comes from the CFPB, or Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and through the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. Oh, good to know. So it appears that we're not able to copy. I'll quickly make those hyperlinks. So bear with me. Here's 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So here I just want to talk very briefly the difference between a credit report and a credit score. So a credit report is going to be a summary of the consumer's credit history at a moment in time. So like I had said, information will fall off between 7 and 10 years once it's closed. So that's why the credit report kind of acts like a report card. The credit score, so this is where different agencies like FICO and Vantage will pull information from the 3 credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, and develop an algorithm to create a credit score. And this can be compared to a GPA. So both the credit score and the credit report are important to understand, and both can provide us with information to be used as key financial education tools. So turning our attention to those credit scores, there are many different credit scores. Today, we're going to talk about FICO and Vantage, but lenders use different scores to measure risk for their unique lending purposes. Basically, lenders might look for distinct characteristics in borrower applying for different types of loans. And credit score developers have developed a variety of calculations to meet the underwriting needs. And there are hundreds of different scores available, most of them ranging between 300 and 850. So thinking about why do credit scores vary? Credit reporting agencies, there are 3 different ones of the big reporting agencies. So TransUnion, Experian, and Equifax. And they have different data reported to them. So not every reporting, not everyone reporting will report to all 3 of those bureaus. The credit score modeler and generations vary also. So if we're looking at Vantage versus FICO, there are some discrepancies. So FICO, or Fair Isaac Corporation, was developed in 1950 and creates the most widely used scores in the lending industry. Mortgage lenders in particular use FICO, and almost exclusively for their underwriting purposes. Vantage Score Solutions was created jointly by the 3 credit bureaus in 2006 in order to design a consumer-friendly and more accessible credit score. So additionally, each lender decides who they report to, as I had mentioned. So, and then finally, the date calculated will impact the score. There are many trade lines. They're updated monthly. So it just depends on when it's reported. In summary, there's not just one score, but many designed for various lending purposes, which contribute to the variance in scoring. Well, let's take a look at some of those specific scoring models. Like I said, we're just focusing on FICO and Vantage today. FICO develops models for each of the different credit bureaus. Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion each have different versions of the FICO score, which we'll see in the next slide. For example, you might have a car loan from a lender who uses Experian FICO Auto Score 8. You also apply for a loan with a different lender that uses FICO Score 8. But because the second lender uses a TransUnion score, your score may not be the same as the score pulled by that first lender. Even if your Experian and TransUnion reports contain the exact same information. Another example might be you receive a monthly FICO score from your credit card company. However, when you apply with your bank for a home equity loan, you discover that the bank uses a different score because they are using a score specifically designated for mortgage lending. Whereas a score from your credit card is just a generic score. Here's a chart showing the different models of the FICO score and how they can be used depending on the type of credit product and each bureau that's using it. And something important to note is that this chart does not have the most up-to-date released models, which is going to be FICO 10 and 10T. But this chart does show that there are a variety of scores used with a wide variety of variance in use and purpose. For example, the most widely used version of is FICO Score 8. However, looking at the versions used in the mortgage lending, we see that Experian used the FICO Score 2, Equifax uses FICO Score 5, and TransUnion uses FICO Score 4. We'll go over these a little bit more in detail later in the presentation. Switching over to VantageScore, while FICO scores are customized for each of the three bureaus, Vantage scores are consistent across the bureaus using the same algorithm. VantageScore is growing in terms of recognition and usage by creditors. However, as noted before, many consumers don't realize that most scores sold are made available to them are Vantage scores. So they've developed an algorithm for FICO and Vantage scores. They have similar or different methods of calculating the scores, but there are some similarities. So starting with the FICO model, we see that number one most important factor in calculating the score is going to be that payment history. That's why we emphasize paying your bills that are reported to the credit agencies on time. It's one of the most important factors in calculating your credit score. And then it's followed by the amounts owed or that credit utilization. So that's going to be how much you're using of what you're able to borrow on those revolving trade lines. And then the other three are a little bit less impactful. So we're looking at the length of credit history, so how long you've had those accounts. And then new credit is going to be those inquiries on the credit report when you're opening up new trade lines. And then we talked earlier about that credit mix. So having a diversified amount of revolving and installment loans. Looking at the Vantage score, so similar to FICO, we see that payment history is extremely influential in creating that credit score. This is followed by the age and type of credit and credit utilization, or percentage of credit limit used. The total balances are moderately influential, and available credit and inquiries are the least influential. So while this is not idyllic, you can see the alignment between the two scoring models. Are credit scores really neutral? While specifics of each score may vary, there are 5 well-publicized categories, which we briefly just reviewed, that comprise common credit scores. So we saw payment history, credit utilization, credit mix, length of history, and new credit. And scoring models do not incorporate sex, marital status, national origin, religion, and race. But also, a fact is that BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, have historically had fewer opportunities to access and build credit. And in our Native communities, we've definitely seen this. Historically, we've had limited opportunities to even access credit. This results in, there it goes, credit scores that, while they may not see race, they do reflect a historical bias and systemic racism. So some examples that credit scores reflect a historical bias and systemic racism are that payment history, so targeted subprime loans, unjust fines, fees, collection actions, and reduced access to traditional financial systems, which place heavier financial burdens on BIPOC consumers to remain current on payments. That credit utilization, we see that our consumers of color may also have more reliant on that high credit utilization during those stressful financial times, and have less income and assets to their counterparts. So though though we do not see race, you can still see that systemic racism. And we have some slides that'll talk about different scoring and how they've tried to address the systemic racism. Well, let's talk about scoring factors and how it relates to each of the pieces of our credit reports. Talking about that first one, payment history. This is the most prominent factor of the scoring model. And that's because we know that building credit requires an active or revolving trade line. We focus on activity of this nature in order to build a payment history. Unfortunately, those other bills like utilities, telecom, and rent are not affecting the payment history because they're not being reported to the credit bureaus. Strong credit factors consist of having those on-time payments, no serious delinquencies, and demonstrating consistent usage of existing credit accounts. As we see those risk factors, they might include delinquencies, late payments, especially within the most recent 6 months. And then you have the previous serious delinquencies of 90 days or more. With delinquencies, the most recent, the more cause for concern and the more the score will drop. Those older and fewer delinquencies, the less impact it'll have on the score. And of course, no delinquencies is always the goal. With credit, it's important to remember that delinquent is considered 30 days late, which is always the best to pay before or by the due date to avoid fees, but you do have that 30-day buffer when it comes to credit reporting. I really like this chart. So the graph shows how the impact of negative events, such as obtaining new credit or closing an account, have over time. As we can see, like I said, time heals all. we can see that it diminishes those impacts negatively that are negatively impacting your credit score will diminish over time. So here we see that a missing payment, that orange line, will affect the score by decreasing it as much as 50%, but that 50% will lessen over 2 years. So it'll almost not be impacting the credit score in 2 years' time. But as we go through, like we said that so if we look at the dark blue line, maxing out a credit card, so credit utilization, if you maxed out all of your revolving accounts, it'll diminish your credit score by 30%. But if you bring those accounts, those balances down to 30% or even 7% is ideal, it can recover in as short as 3 months' time. And then that last line at the bottom, we see that this is where we try to mitigate bankruptcy as much as possible because it has the biggest impact on your credit score. And then it'll take it down to as much as 90%, especially in that first month. But as we see the trend over time, you start to see an upswing in your credit score by 2 years. And by the time you hit that 7-year mark, it's officially fallen off your credit report, depending on the type of bankruptcy you've had. Oh, looking at, so I also like this chart because we can see that they try not to kick you while you're down. So let's look at the impact of missed payments. Here we've got Mike on the left side, who's in that prime range. He's got 660 to 740. And then we have Jeff, who's subprime. He's 550 to 600 of that credit score. And we want to see the credit scoring range and the impact that it has. So if Mike is 30 days late, he's going to see an impact of 70 to 90 points. So he'll be dropped 70 to 90 points. However, Jeff in that subprime level, the same credit card, same amount of days late, he'll only see 35 to 50 in a point drop. As we go through those installment loans have a little bit varied of so between a car loan and a mortgage, you're going to see higher impact if you miss payments on your mortgage. But we see that Jeff is hit a little bit less than Mike is. And then so on and so forth. So if they go into collections, Mike could see 100 to 150 for those external collections. And then Jeff at subprime sees about 50 to 80%. So the moral of Mike and Jeff's story is that they try not to kick you while you're down. If you're already working on credit building and have some slip ups and you're in that subprime level, you're not going to see as big of an impact if you were in that prime range. We also want to recognize that many people just struggle to decide whether to save money or to use it to pay bills or debt when they have limited income, and you can't always do both. On one hand, building and retaining a savings is great. We want to support participants in building their savings and emergency funds. On the other hand, many people have missed payments or debt that they are interested in paying down. One of these things we see is that people are sometimes reluctant to take their hard-earned money out of savings and use it to put toward debt payment. Looking at a small case study, we'll see the impact of a late payment and what it can do to someone's credit score. Both people here in this example have 680 and both have medical emergency, a medical emergency that'll throw off that payment, making them unable to use their monthly income to lower their monthly credit card payment. Person A doesn't have any money from their regular income to pay their credit card payment and also doesn't want to touch their savings. So they miss their credit card payment. And as a result, 6 months later, their score is dropped to 600. So they can now only get a car loan at 24%. On the other hand, person B decides to use some of their hard-earned savings to cover that monthly credit card payment to avoid being considered late. This resulted in them keeping their credit score intact and being approved for a car loan 6 months later. So an emphasis on maintaining those payments because it might pay it forward in the future for accessing credit if you need it. The second most important factor in credit scoring is that outstanding debt or credit utilization. Credit scores typically consider both the total outstanding debt to include installment and revolving obligations, as well as those collection accounts with outstanding balances, and credit utilization on revolving debt. So credit utilization can be defined as the ratio of the amount of debt outstanding against the total credit limit. Strong factors of outstanding debt consist of using less than 10% of that revolving credit, paying off balances before it's sent to the credit bureaus, and in general, keeping the balances very low on revolving accounts. Risk factors consist of having multiple maxed out cards, overall high debt levels, or a single account that's maxed out. Unlike installment loans or mortgages, monthly payments on revolving debt is more fluid. Traditional advice in the industry has been to keep credit utilization below 30% for good scores, but reducing it even further will continue to support credit score improvement. While it's good advice, especially for those with high utilization, this is just a rule of thumb. The impact of any one individual's credit utilization is subject to many factors on the credit report. Overall, when it comes to credit utilization, the lower is the better. The next component of maintaining credit or strong credit is that length of history. But remember, it's about 15% of that FICO score. With credit building, like any relationship, it takes time and patience for trust to form. Strong credit factors of length of history include using a long history on file, indicating more experienced of a credit user. While risk factors are little or short length of credit history, there are some things that can be done to avoid negatively affecting the length of history, your length of history, such as keeping those accounts open. Some factors may make up calculating the length of history, including the age of the oldest account, as well as the average age of open accounts. So we have more control over the revolving accounts than we do the installment, because like we said, installment lines will only remain open for that fixed length of time. And we had a question in the chat for those who may be getting their student loans forgiven. Is it expected to positively or negatively impact their credit score? On one hand, it lowers the debt, but on the other hand, that account is closed. Do they just balance out and their credit report is ineffective for the most part, depending on the balance, of course? So, great question. The impact of closing an account is very low. So they might see maybe a 10% impact but it will negatively impact their credit score. But if it'll be pretty minimal. Similar with like closing out a mortgage or a car loan, you might see a drop in like 5 to 10 points if you're at that prime level. So it is good. Don't keep it open for the sake of not having a closed installment account. It's best just to pay the debt. But also keep in mind you will be knocked down probably at, like I said, 5 to 10 points. Inquiries. So these are applications for credit. Inquiries can either be soft or hard, but only hard inquiries affect your credit score. More so for someone with a thin flat file, fewer than 3 trade lines, than for someone with a thicker file. So the most significant effects come in a few months following the application, or often in a range of no more than 10 to 20 points in drop. Strong credit factors include only applying for credit as it's needed and shopping around for the best rates like auto loans, mortgages, or student loans within an uninterrupted 2-week period. So it's important to note that it depends on when it's being reported to the credit bureau. So some people will say, oh, only shop around. The rule of thumb was a 30-day window for mortgages, and to stick with one type of installment and not open a new credit line. But now we're starting to say around 14 days is that window. So 2 weeks to shop, just because of the date of reporting can vary. So unlike with the unsecured credit applications, credit scores do not recognize the need for and encourage customers to comparison shop for certain financial products. Risk factors and inquiries, again, for the FICO score is only 10% of your total score. So you can't ruin your score by opening too many trade lines. But your risk factors you want to look out for is many inquiries throughout the past year, the possibility of taking on too much debt, or it shows that you're in crisis mode. Shopping around due to lack of approval. So you can shop around, but if you keep getting denied, that is kind of a red flag. And then, or due to an emerging credit profile, these risk factors can be common. From a creditor's perspective, these are red flags or indicators that you might be in financial stress. So keep those inquiries to a minimum. And finally, we want to look at that credit mix. Like I said, again, it's only 10% of your overall score. And I advise if you're like, oh, I only have credit cards, please do not open an installment loan to do a credit mix. So creditors want to see that individuals know how to use different types of credit over a long period of time. So we know that revolving and installment trade lines are structured distinctly. Thus, in many cases, creditors care to view how consumers manage an account that is most similar to the trade line that they are considering extending. So if you're looking at opening an account, if you're looking at opening an installment account, they might want to see that you've, in the last 7 to 10 years, have been able to manage one in your history. But just like the slide says, a risk factor can be only having one type of account on record. It's possible to build credit history with just one trade line. We maximize from having a mix of products on our credit report. Like I said, it's It's important to keep your goals in mind, and it's not necessary to apply for different types of credit just to diversify your credit mix. Okay, and just reiterating again, the best practices for creating those strong credit scores are to keep it active, paying it on time, and building a mix of 3 or more trade lines as it reflects in your goals. So if you don't have a mix, don't worry. Keep it low. So keeping those debt balances low on your revolving trade lines, it's just a best practice to keep it below that 10% range. And then to keep it up. So at least 6 months of activity is required to obtain a FICO score, and we must use it or lose it. Okay, we'll move in a little bit. We talked about the score. Now we're going to get to know the report. So the credit report's an important tool that may be overwhelming for some people to look at and to interpret. So good question, does having a finance company versus a bank or a credit union negatively affect the credit scores? Nope, it's just whoever's reporting to those 3 bureaus. It doesn't matter if it's Chase or XYZ mortgage company, just as long as they're reporting and you're not late on payments. And like I said earlier, those collections accounts will negatively affect your credit score. But who the lender is, it doesn't matter. A credit report is an important tool, like I said, and yeah, let's get into the different types, what's on the credit report. First, let's look at that personal identifying information. So this is going to be your name, current or previous address, employer information, spouse or co-applicant information, date of birth, contact information, and other contact information. Some information only gets updated when a consumer applies for credit, so it's not unusual for information to be out of date. While information in this section has no effect on the score, it's important to review the data for inaccuracies, as it could be a sign of identity theft. It could also be a sign of human error. So CRAs, or credit reporting agencies, receive personal identifying information from a variety of sources. So they could get it from public records, directly from the courts. They gather information that has been used to pull a credit report. So whatever information for name and address are entered into, they will be attached to that consumer report. Anytime you've applied for credit and that agency's reporting, it'll report what you have told them. So it's easy to have reported misspelled names, different variations of names, as well as those incorrect social security numbers. If a consumer has not had access to credit recently or has used credit inconsistently in the past, it's not uncommon for the information to be out of date or incomplete. So definitely get any personal identifying information cleared up with the credit bureaus directly if there's any discrepancies. Something that they do not include is the gender, ethnicity, religion, and political affiliation. They also do not include credit scores. We'll talk about that in the next few slides. The next section is credit history. So this is the main section of the credit report, and it provides information on what type of credit accounts a consumer has used in the past or is not currently using. Credit history includes the type of accounts, payments, outstanding balances, credit limits, date the accounts were open and closed, their current status, such as if payments have been made on time or late, and how late those payments were. So they will show whether it was 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days past due. Frequently, you'll find that information on the credit history section is organized into different categories, such as positive and derogatory statuses, and whether the accounts are open or closed. They may be organized by type of account as well. Let's start with positive accounts, or accounts in good standing, as they're often called. Accounts in good standing refers to credit accounts that have no history of negative information. These accounts could be opened or closed. And are still in use or able to be used. Accounts that are open and continue to be reported by the creditor will remain open indefinitely, like I said at the beginning of the presentation. So even if they're not being used regularly, once an account's in good standing and paid in full and closed, the record will remain on the credit report for 10 years following that date of closure. So important times to note. Moving on to the credit history section, that may be a potential for negative impact on the credit report. First, we may have open and closed accounts that are either currently delinquent or have a history of missed or late payments. In addition, accounts that have become seriously delinquent may appear on the credit report as accounts in collections. Generally, this type of information can have a negative impact on your credit score and remains on the credit report for a period of about 7 years from when the consumer was first 30 days behind. This 7-year timeline is defined by the Fair Credit Reporting. Contrary to some common myths and misconceptions, the clock cannot be reset due to consumer activities such as contacting a creditor or making a payment. Even if a consumer does pay an old debt or a collection off, the history of negative information will remain on the credit report for 7 years from the date of first delinquency. Here's some definitions that might be helpful in terms, so for some terms that might be confusing. So a charge-off or charged off account is a status that a lender may list on a trade line that indicate that a debt has been deemed unlikely to be collected due to substantial delinquency. An account that has been charged off could mean that the creditor will send the account to collections. This does not mean that the consumer no longer owes the debt or that the debt has been forgiven. An account in collection is a delinquent or past due account that is moved out of the routine account processing to an internal collection department or that third-party debt collection agency. This may include accounts that were previously reported on the credit report when active, such as that loan and credit reports, or accounts that have not been previously reported. So if it moves into collections, it might be a telecom or utility account that only reported if they had become a collection. So something important to note, that an account in collection may not have been previously reported on your credit report, but it might once it goes into okay. Moving along, we have public records. So here, before 2018, public records that appeared on the credit report included civil judgments, tax liens, and bankruptcies. Civil judgments and tax liens have been deemed to have high potential for inaccuracies and have been completely removed from consumer credit reports. Bankruptcies are the only type of public records appearing on your credit report. So if you have something that's not a bankruptcy on there, clear it up with the credit bureau. And like I had mentioned, these records stay on your credit report for 7 to 10 years, depending on or from the filing date and depending on the type of bankruptcy. So I know it's a little confusing here because Chapter 13 stays on for 7 years because that's a restructure of a debt. And a Chapter 7 is on your credit report for up to 10 years from the filing date. And that's because that's the debt has been liquidated, I believe. So it's important to know that the consumer may still owe their debts or have other judgments, even though they're not on their credit report. Scores are not on your credit report. Your credit scores, you can obtain those through your FICO and your Vantage Score. They're going to be different than those 3 major credit bureaus of Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion. And then we have another question in the question Q&A box. Does biweekly payments on a mortgage give a borrower a lower, and I'm assuming that says, oh, yes, there it is. The full question is lower credit score on your credit report. Doing biweekly payments, so they're reported every month. So it should not give you a lower score because you're still paying at least once a month. But if you miss any of the payments, then it could be, if you miss a payment beyond that 30-day window, it will be reported as a missed payment. Inquiries. Soft inquiries are initiated by consumers and some businesses for educational and informational purposes only. So some common examples are when you pull your own credit report, regardless of where you pull it from, it's going to be a soft inquiry. When a business pulls from your credit report, when an employer pulls your credit report with your permission, I might add, and then when a business, if they're looking for promotion, all those promotions you receive in the mail, like, oh, you qualified, they pulled a soft inquiry and it does not show up on your credit, or it does not impact your credit score. You'll see soft inquiries on your credit report from the past 24 months in the inquiries section. And like I said, they do not impact your score. So if you have, like, I accessed my credit report a few weeks ago and there are like hundreds of soft inquiries. Don't worry because they do not impact your credit score. Hard inquiries, on the other hand, are when you apply for credit. So this is where it's going to impact your credit score. And it's for a period of 12 months. The applications for credit will appear both on the consumer and business division reports for 24 months. So those hard inquiries impact the score for 12 months and stay on the report for 24. And then another thing to keep in mind is that they do only impact by 10% for that FICO score. Okay, let's discuss how we can use the report to access readiness for credit building. I'm just doing a quick time check. Okay. So here we have financial products that might influence your credit building. Debt obligations that may reflect your ability to manage emergencies and save, and access to asset building credit may reflect potential for financial security. I'm noticing the time and how many slides we have left, so probably going to talk a little bit faster through this section. So it's important to create a credit action plan. Here we want to look at the good, the bad, the accurate, and the inaccurate. And anything that's inaccurate, we want to dispute with the credit bureaus directly. So if you pulled your TransUnion report and you see something on it that's not accurate, go to TransUnion and say this is inaccurate and it needs to be changed. What's not on the credit report. So here's an area where we want to look at, is there potential to open a new positive trade line? So when you're assessing your credit report and creating a credit action plan for yourself or with a participant or client, there might be areas to help with credit building. We want to consider our goals or our participants' goals and how credit can be aligned to that goal attainment, and not opening credit for the sake of opening credit. And then finally, we want to know, is it affordable? So not going in under our heads just for the sake of credit building. Okay. So just to review, like I'd said earlier, these are the different areas for closed accounts or late payments, open positive accounts. So on that open side, we want to, this is where credit building counts. So on the left-hand side, everything's closed to new activity, and that's just going to stay on your report. But in the case of credit building, this is where active accounts with a positive status have the potential to become active. And like I said, maintain active on-time trade lines. The credit report can help us paint a picture of how our participants or ourselves are doing financially. So it can help determine our next steps. So let's look at a few case studies. Here we have Abner and Linda. They're immigrants from Iraq. They have no credit history. They have variable income around $3,000 and savings goal of $3,000. And their goal is to expand a business and home ownership. So these would be good candidates for credit building. So assuming that they, like we said, within 6 months, they could have that active, they could have that active trade line to access credit if they have that one active trade line for 6 months. Next, we have the thin file. So here we have Raven, who's a 4-year-old Native woman. Her credit score is 645 and she only has student loans. Her income varies around the 2,000 mark, savings 500, debt 5,000. And her goal is to increase savings and have home ownership. Raven can build credit strategically by opening a new installment or revolving account. And then finally, we have the thicker file. So this is a couple, Martin and Juanita. They're in their early 60s, Martin 740, Juanita 755. And their monthly income is around 2,700. Their debt is 20,000 or more in credit cards and medical debt. So their goal is to decrease debt. For those with thicker file, one of the questions to explore is whether they need credit building or do they simply need to work on maximizing their credit score using their existing credit products that they already have. So that's maybe they'll be good for credit building. So overall, credit building is a powerful strategy, but it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. So this is a case study that'll be in the slides, but again, looking at the time and the amount of slides we have to go through, we'll jump ahead. We want to consider the red flags. So some red flags that you might be in crisis mode will be that a tendency to miss payments, struggling to pay those basic bills, and with your credit utilization over 30% or more. If you have large accounts and collections, if you might look like you're at risk of garnishments and contemplating foreclosure or bankruptcy. So now that we've reviewed access to credit, we want to remember to review our credit reports, check for accuracy, and dispute those those errors. Know your score category and any risk factors that might be associated with that. And then finally, what products you might be eligible for. Again, there's a list of resources I can drop in the chat. I'll drop it in once we're wrapping up. So debt management alone is not a credit building strategy. But they're often hand in hand. So credit building and managing debt. Yes, while managing debt, there are a few things to consider, both from a debt management and a credit building perspective. There should be something to manage, and second, there should be ongoing on-time payments to sustain that credit building. Let's look at, very briefly, we talked about this before, but this is a little analogy to guide us through to view how credit building can work. So inactive status, so here's our analogy, is that we're in a boat and we're staying afloat with those high credit scores compared to the low credit scores. What it means to have active debt means we're above the waterline. We have accounts that are open and either active or have the potential to become active. So we may have current or past due, and it has a potential to become negative on our credit score, but we're still afloat. So let's talk about debt. And not all debt is bad, as long as they're managed and well and maintained in good standing. So here we're looking at that healthy debt. It could be that mortgage or those installment loans, and revolving loans with that low utilization. The recommendation is to make those on-time payments, reduce the balances, and avoid maxing out any one revolving account. And definitely not maxing out all of the revolving accounts. So we might start to see a little sink in our boat if we make even one late payment. So when we were talking about Mike and Jeff previously, we saw that, one late payment for Mike dropped him by 100 points. Let's look at late but active. So we're moving into that orange category of those quadrants that we looked at earlier. So if you already missed a payment and you're going to bring your credit score down, we want to avoid missed payments by always making the minimum payment required, keeping us above that waterline. But if we fall behind, we want to get caught up quickly. The quicker that a past due account is brought to current, the quicker the credit score will begin to recover. So remembering that timeline that we saw of how time heals all, as soon as we bring that account back to past due, the quicker it's going, or less time it'll take to recover our credit score. Okay, debt reduction approaches for those late but active accounts. on the slide, we want to assess our budget, how much we have available to put toward our payments. We want to make a payment plan, inventory our debts, apply any surplus money to those high priority debts, and to pay off debts one by one. So here's a case study. This is using the avalanche method. So where we're going to pay off our debts with the highest interest rate first. Here we see that Ramona has 8,700. She's budgeted 400 toward payments. And we can see that first month, you still want to make those minimum payments. So don't neglect any cards for the sake of paying one off. So that 400 spread out throughout the month looks like she's putting 325 toward that first retail card. And then she's got ABC Bank and the big bank card where she's making minimum payments. After 10 months, she finally pays off almost $3,000 of that retail card. And continuing on the avalanche, she's allocated that $400 a month. So now with the minimum payment on Big Bank, she's able to apply $350 each month to the ABC Bank card. And by almost 2 years, she's paid off the ABC Bank card. Now she has the total $400 to throw at Big Bank card each month. And by month 27, she knocks out all of her debt. So it's not a quick way to deal with that, but it is over time can be the will save you the most amount of money is using this avalanche debt method. There are other methods to think about which are in the resources, and I'll drop those in the chat. But Power Play is a resource you can use to look at different types of tools to pay down your debts. Okay. So charge off and debt collection. So once we've had those, they're only negative impacts on our accounts. So as we see in this example, they're anchors that are just going to weigh us down for the duration of the time that they're left on our account, and there's no way to bring them back up. So only time can heal a charge off, an account in collections, and a bankruptcy. So again, a charge off account is going to be that unpaid balance reported. The account's been unpaid to the lender. You'll see the term charge off used on credit reports for accounts with outstanding balances that are past due. And the time, the level varies between lenders, but it's common for this to occur after the borrower is 90 to 100 days past due. And the term, and it's crucial to know that the borrower is still legally responsible for the remaining of the balance, even if it's charged off or written off. And the lender can still pursue collection of the debt through an internal collection department by selling the account to an external agency, or by pursuing a judgment through the court system. And then again, that account in collection is a delinquent or past due account that's moved into or out of routine processing to that collection department. Public records, this is data through the court system as it relates to debts with legal ramification. But remember, only bankruptcies are reported on your credit report. So it's important to know that derogatory accounts such as charge off and collections can never be active once they're charged off. It means they can only negatively impact the score, but there are things that we can do to reduce this negative impact. Though charge-off accounts can be returned to an activist status, cannot be returned to that active status. We do have options. So we can pay or settle with the original creditor. This will prevent the account being sent to collections, and it resolves the debt. So making sure that make sure that you have written confirmation of the debt payment. Time is, like I said, time heals all. It's an important part of the equation. So here we see that the biggest potential is that new unpaid collection account. An older unpaid or settled collection account will have less impact. And then that old and unpaid collection account, just over time, that'll lessen the effect on your credit score. So there are some things to keep in mind. So paying in full, this means that this is the best for your credit score if you pay that collection account in full. Settling will cost less money, but you might be taxed on any forgiven amount. And then payment plans, just exercise caution with a creditor because it can be a sign of new documents or an agreement that can result in a new loan agreement. So just exercise caution there. The following collections do not impact the score. So paid in full collections on different scoring models won't be a factor in your credit score. And then collections may vary. Under 100 for those later FICO score models will not impact your credit score. So something to keep in mind, those low collections accounts. They may appear on your credit report though, so just keep that in mind. Medical debt is treated a little differently than collections, so it can't be reported for 100 days after the it's transferred to collections. If it's paid through insurance, it'll be removed from the report. So something to keep in mind, that if it's still showing up, even though it's been paid through insurance, something to settle with the credit bureau. Things to keep in mind when moving from collections to public records is that you want to look up your statute of limitations on those collections, because creditors may still pursue legal action if the debt is not paid, and they can still take the borrower to court. And then only public records that show up on their credit report are those bankruptcies. Like I said before, they'll stay on your credit report depending on the type for 7 to 10 years. They have significant negative impact, and as you can see, the boat is definitely going down. But over time, your boat will go back to float. And credit can be rebuilt after bankruptcy. Okay. So like I said, civil judgments don't appear on your credit report, but it doesn't mean that it won't impact you. So in summary, there's no one size fits all approach to debt. So keep your boat afloat. We're coming up real fast on time. So we want to look at accounts in good standing will be on there indefinitely. I've already hit all of these. So that date of first delinquency will be on there for 7 years. Charge off to collections will be 7 years from that date of first delinquency. Bankruptcies will be 7 to 10 years. A foreclosure will be 7, and those inquiries are only on there for 2 years. And again, date of first delinquency is the first 30 days or more past the lending or the due date, leading to the most derogatory status. Statute of limitations. The date of an account was overturned to collections and the date of last activity. These are not the date of first delinquency. Just remember that to look up your state's statute of limitations, and the date of first delinquency is just that first time it was late. Statute of limitations is the law that sets the maximum amount of time that a creditor has to pursue a lawsuit. So it might fall off your account if you're in a state where the statute of limitations is 10 years, that the collections agency might be able to still pursue you after the 7-year date of first delinquency. But it might only be 3 years. So they might have reached their statute of limitations on being able to pursue you, but it still might show up on your credit report. So they're not the same, just to know those two. This will be in the slides. I know we're coming up on time. There are a few more slides that we did not get to that you can check, and I'll drop, like I mentioned before, here are those tools. I'll drop those in the chat. So PowerPlay, Undebit, and Vertex are templates you can use. And there are more resources, a lot of resources to help you get out of debt. And I will answer any questions in the Q&A and turn it over to Lewis to guide us out of the webinar.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great webinar. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm a big fan of getting my credit together, so it's always good to get some refresher and get some good information. So everyone, can you do us a huge favor and go to our survey today? Your feedback is valuable to us. Just please submit your survey response to the link below. I think we'll be putting it in the chat for you also. There you go. It's in the chat. And I said, our survey is very, very important for us. It gives us all the feedback we need to make sure our webinars are the best. Next slide, please. Our next webinar will be May 24th, 2022, Business Startup 101. That's going to be 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, and 11 a.m. Pacific. And as always, registration is free. Next slide. You can access any of our recorded webinars anytime through the CATHEDA web page. If you go directly to our nativelendingcenter.com, just click on the link for CATHEDA recorded webinars, and you can go from there. Next slide. You can check out all our upcoming events on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Twitter. You also can check out our monthly podcast at any of the major listing sites as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and also directly on our own at Simplecast. Next slide. Thank you so much for everyone for coming out, and have a wonderful day.